Hello and welcome to this short webinar about NIST Cybersecurity Framework version 2.0. CertiKit are a leading creator of compliance toolkits, including a toolkit for NIST Cybersecurity Framework version 2. You can find out more about us at CertiKit.com. My name is Ken Holmes. I'm CertiKit's CEO. I'm the author of many of our toolkits, and I have a 30-year experience in information technology and information security particularly. Today we're going to talk about who are NIST, what is the cybersecurity framework and what's its structure, and what's new in version 2.0 of the framework. Then we'll go through some quick questions and answers. The National Institute of Standards and Technology is a fairly heavyweight US government agency, which effectively represents the US on most aspects of standardization of technology in particular. It's quite a long-standing agency. It was founded in 1901 by Congress. Is originally called the National Bureau of Standards, and the US government calls on NIST for many important tasks, including an investigation of the World Trade Center collapse as a result of the September 11th attacks. So they get involved in a lot of things. At the moment they're in the news because of AI and investigation and representation of standards to do with AI. So if there's anything to do with technology, NIST gets involved on behalf of the US government. So in 2013, an executive order from President Obama mandated the creation of a cybersecurity framework, with the Cybersecurity Enhancement Act of 2014 placing further emphasis on NIST's role in cybersecurity. The first version of the framework was published in 2014, and it was updated in April 2018 with CSF 1.1. The use of the cybersecurity framework was made compulsory for federal agencies by President Trump in an executive order, strengthening the cybersecurity of federal networks and critical infrastructure in 2017. A strong aspect of the legislation dealing with the CSF is the need for it to stay up to date, to drive improvement, and to encourage close cooperation between the private and public sectors. To this end, NIST embarked on the journey to CSF 2.0 with a comprehensive program of consultation, including a series of well-attended workshops and invitations for comment. The final version of CSF 2 was published in February 2024. So what's the structure of the cybersecurity framework? Well, it consists of a core, which is made up of three main levels. So at the top we have the functions: govern, identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover, which are shown often in that circle we saw on the previous slide. Within each function we then have a number of categories, and within each category we then have subcategories. So we can go through in a bit more detail what each of these things consist of. Here's a list of the categories within each of the functions. So you can see that the number of categories varies according to the function, with govern, which is the new one with version 2.0, having the most categories. Some of these in 1.1 have been taken out and put into the govern function. Each of them also has a category identifier. So you can see the first one here within the govern function, we have the category organizational context, and that's known as GV.OC. So this is a convention that's carried out within the CSF, as is the color coding, as you can see here. Let's have a look at the wording of some of these things. So on this slide here we have the govern function, and you'll see that in each case for the functions, the categories and the subcategories, the text is written in statement form effectively. So it's making a statement which you can either agree with or disagree with if you're doing sort of a gap assessment against this. But basically it's a statement of what should be the case. So for the govern function, we're saying the organization's cybersecurity risk management strategy, etc., etc. And then within that function, we then have one of the categories, the organizational context category, GVOC, again, stating that the circumstances, mission, stakeholder expectations, etc., are understood. So again, it's a statement of fact, which may or may not be the case, and it's something to work towards. And then within the category, we have 5 subcategories. So GVOC01, the organizational mission is understood. Again, written in the same way. So the idea of the CSF is that an organization works towards each of these things becoming true of their organization. And obviously they set out the aspirations effectively in cybersecurity terms of what should be the case within the organization. So I mentioned the idea of a gap assessment against the categories or the subcategories within the CSF. Gap assessment isn't really a term that's used by NIST in the context of this, but the terminology that is used is to have a current and a target profile, which is kind of a similar concept to a gap assessment. So the current profile is a statement of where you are now, and the target profile would be where you want to get to. So as part of the planning process to implement the CSF, it's a case of taking each of these statements that are in the functions, the categories and the subcategories, and assessing whether your organization currently meets them. And the set of those answers will form your current profile. You then need to decide where you want to be with each of these things, and those answers would then represent your target profile. And then the implementation is a case of working from the current profile towards the target profile in a managed way. We also have the concept of tiers as well as profiles. So there are 4 tiers which range from partial to adaptive. So the idea of this is they're effectively measures as to how well something is implemented. NIST is often at pains to point out that it doesn't necessarily make sense for an organization to be at tier 4 for everything. So as part of defining your current to target profile, you may want to say, okay, we're starting at tier 1 of this particular subcategory, and where we'd like to be is tier 3. So that gives you a target effectively to work towards without necessarily having to take it to all the way to tier 4. The idea is not to waste resources on establishing controls that aren't necessarily productive or cost effective. So tiers allow you to use that element of nuance that otherwise would be missing. So those are the main components of the cybersecurity framework. Let's talk a bit about what's new in version 2. The last version was 1.1. The most obvious change is that there is a new govern function. So previously there were 5 functions, now there are 6. So govern is the sort of overarching function that you've seen within the wheel, is inside the wheel, and has links into each of the other areas. So as a result of that, as a result of picking out some of these things into a govern function, some subcategories have moved from previous functions into the govern function. There are a few new categories as well, particularly within the protect function. There are also now implementation examples, which are further explanations effectively of how to interpret some of the subcategories. So there'll be an example of what an organization might do in order to meet the kind of statement format that you saw within the subcategory. So what have you got to do to be able to comply with what the subcategory is telling you? And I think those will be quite useful. What was in previous 1.1, informative references, which are references to other standards to bring in that additional information to interpret and provide more meat on the bone effectively to the cybersecurity framework. Those informative references were previously in the PDF. They've now been moved into an online tool, which is available via the NIST website. And lastly, there is more emphasis on improvement within version 2.0 of the CSF. There was some before, but they've beefed that up. So those are the main changes. A quick summary of the main points. The first one is that NIST has a huge amount of credibility within cybersecurity, and we all should be listening very carefully to what it says on standards, and the cybersecurity framework is an important part of the output that they throw out there in terms of helping not only US organizations but organizations worldwide defend themselves in cyberspace. So that's the first thing. The CSF is, as we've seen, made up of functions, categories and subcategories, increasing the detail as we go along that list. But there's also the concepts of tiers 1 to 4 and profiles with the current and the target profile. Reference tools and other information are on the NIST website, and some of the information that was previously in the PDF of the CSF has now gone into an online tool. So it's worth having a look at the NIST website to get more information about that. And lastly, that version 2.0 is really more of a foray of NIST into the international standard area. It's not just applicable to US federal organizations. They're moving it into companies. It's always applied to companies really, but the private sector, but also there is an international element to this. So they're basically saying it's not just US, it can be useful to organizations worldwide, which is a welcome change. Just briefly before we get on to questions, don't forget that CertiKit has a toolkit for the NIST Cybersecurity Framework version 2.0, which can provide a lot of the documentation that you need in order to implement these subcategories, these controls that we're talking about, and to create your current and target profile and a whole lot besides. Okay, let's have a look at some questions that have been asked about the cybersecurity framework. The first one is, can our organization become certified to the CSF 2.0? The short answer is no. There isn't a certification scheme that is approved by NIST, and they have no plans to create one. So compared to some of the other standards that are certifiable, this isn't something that you should get into if you want to have a certificate that proves that you have implemented it. So a short answer there. Second question is, how does the CSF 2.0 compare with ISO 27001, the international standard for information security? I think one of the main things there is the certification aspect. So you can become, an organization can become certified to 27001. I think with version 2.0 of the CSF, there's a lot more overlap with 27001 than there was previously. So the govern function addresses a lot of the things that are within the management system of 27001, and a lot of the rest of the cybersecurity framework kind of maps onto the Annex A controls from 27001. So as you'd expect, there's a lot of overlap because they obviously address the same kinds of areas. Question 3, why would we use the NIST Cybersecurity Framework? Well, leading on from that, the answer to the previous question, I think you would probably use NIST, particularly if you're US based, because it has a lot more publicity in America, and probably carries a lot more weight if you can say you've implemented the cybersecurity framework. Other countries outside the US increasingly, but possibly less. So if you're looking outside the US, then probably 27001 might be a better bet for you. But I think that will change over a period of time. I think that they're two very good choices. As I say, there's a lot of overlap. It depends whether you want a management system in the ISO context in place, or whether you want to go with the CSF structure of functions, categories, and subcategories. But both very good. Question 4, how would we go about implementing the CSF 2.0? As I mentioned before, effectively it's a case of doing a gap assessment, which is the current and target profile. That's a good place to start. Risk assessment is a key part of the CSF, as it is with 27001. So it's really a case of assessing your risks, assessing where you are, where you want to get to, and then starting off a project to implement those areas where you are currently lacking effectively. If you use the tiers as well, then you can say we want to get from tier 1 to tier 2 or 3 or maybe even 4. So it's a case of planning the project out there. Within the toolkit I mentioned, there are some tools to help you to do that. And lastly, question 5, where can I find out more about CSF 2.0? I mentioned the NIST website. There's a lot of useful things on there, as well as getting the source document, which is free from NIST. So the implementation examples and the informative references and so on are in a tool on the NIST website, and they're starting to build a very good library of supporting information about the cybersecurity framework. So well worth a visit to their website. Okay, that's it from me. I'm Ken Holmes from CertiKit. Thank you for watching.